Yeah. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Wyomissing Public Library Meet the Author program, which we haven't had one of these in a while. So it's a pleasure to introduce Roger Rank, who is a native son of Berks County, native of Shillington, graduate of Albright College, and retired from the University of Arkansas as a doctor of medical sciences, which just thinking about that puts knots in my stomach. But thank you for doing this, Roger.
Oh,
really
I'm delighted.
appreciate it. So tell us how you got involved in all of this.
Okay, sure. Well, I appreciate the opportunity, considering I gave you short notice last week that I was going to be in town. And
okay.
but yeah, it's been fun. It's always fun to be back in Reading. I said I grew up here, but I've been away for 45 years, and other than maybe once a year visiting. But actually, what I'm going to do is start the PowerPoint, because because one of my slides, I'll tell you how I kind of got into this whole thing, and Bonnie knows. You see, but let me see if I can get do the screen share properly.
Oh, boy.
Okay.
Okay, there you go.
There we go. Everybody got that?
Yep. Yep.
How's my volume? Is the volume okay?
Yep. Fine.
Okay,
And
good.
if everybody would please save your questions till Roger has finished his
Yeah,
presentation.
probably be a good idea.
Sure.
Okay, so what I want to say, first of all, I got into this through these two gentlemen, Keith Heberling, who's an executive at the Anderson advertising company, and Ron Devlin, who many of you know is a reporter for the Reading Eagle, doing a lot of good Berks County history articles. And what happened is it was just serendipity at its finest. Keith had come across a cache of letters, copies of letters that were written by several German POWs to my father from between 1945 or actually 46 through 1950. And I had some letters that my mother had saved, but Keith had a large number, and I was not aware that they existed. And when Keith got he had come across, and I won't go into all the details and how he came across them, but he thought that these are something that needs to be preserved. And Ron had just done an article about the Reading, the POW camp at the Reading airfield. And Keith had seen that, and he contacted Ron and said, "Hey, I got all these letters. Why don't, it might be worth an article." And indeed, Ron wrote an article about the letters, and of course talks about my father and Otto Vilka and Walter Getz. And but it's the Reading Eagle. I lived in Arkansas. I don't see the Reading Eagle daily, although now I do have a online subscription. I felt guilty. I felt I should have one. And but my aunt, who was my late aunt, who was then over at the Highlands, my mother's sister, we talk, routinely. And I called her one Sunday, and she said, "Hey, there was an article in the Eagle about your father." I said, "Really?" And so when I got off the phone, I immediately went online and tracked down the article and saw it. And yeah, it was. And I was aware of that my father had been at the airfield during the war, and that he was friends with the prisoners. In fact, I was a pen pal with Walter Getz's son when I was a teenager. But I contacted Ron and said, "Hey, can you get me in contact with Keith? I'd love to either see the letters or ideally get some copies of them." And Ron set it up. I drove up in February of 2019. I drove up here and we had dinner, and Keith was kind enough to give me copies of the whole collection. And I took him back. I put him in chronological order and spent time fortunately, I can read and speak German, and I'm married to a German also. So when I get stuck, she bails me out. And then so I thought this is really a very compelling story. And then I started doing the research and then put together the book. So I thank these two gentlemen. Without them, this never would have happened. So anyway, I'm going to get into it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to back off on some of the politics of it. I'm going to talk about it because in the book I talk about, I give the letters in the context of the political events, and I'm going to still talk about that, but I'm going to let their letters, let them speak to you from 75 years ago. I put this up to start with because I saw this interview with Ken Burns, who I'm sure you all know has done incredible historical documentaries on the Civil War, World War II, baseball, just did one on Hemingway. And he was asked in the interview, why do you do these historical documentaries about war? And he said, clearly wars are the worst things that humans do. It reveals the worst of us. But paradoxically, it is also an environment in which more often than not, the very best of us is also on display. And I found that the very best of us is on display. And even in the midst of horrors of war, good things happen. And I thought that kind of explains what happened between my father and the two Germans. So these are the three gentlemen, and there were other POWs that worked with my father, but my father, Roy Rank, he was born in 1902. He was born in Fredericksburg in Lebanon County. In around 1911, my grandfather moved the family to Reading, and then in about 1930, moved him into Shillington. And my father spent virtually all his life in Shillington. He was a painter and paper hanger. When the war, he was initially drafted in 1943, but he was too old and he was discharged. But when the airfield opened, he applied for a job out there. They wanted civilian contractors to do a variety of jobs, and he headed up the paint shop at the air base. So, and then Walter, at that time, he was 43 years old. Walter Goetz was born in Wuppertal, Barmen, in the Ruhr Valley in Germany. He was basically conscripted in 1939. He joined the Luftwaffe in the airborne troops. And although he ended up really he wasn't really a combat soldier. He ended up at the rank of sergeant. He, I believe, worked more in a quartermaster capacity as an accountant. But he was in a unit that was in the initial Operation Barbarossa invading Russia. Again, he didn't see combat. After about 2 years in Russia, he returned. He was transferred back. Well, those units stayed, but he was transferred back to Germany, did additional training as airborne. And then in 1944, right after D-Day, his unit had returned to Germany, and he was then transferred over to, they were moved to Brest on the Brittany Peninsula. And then in August, as the Third Army under Patton was moving to Brittany, his unit was surrounded, isolated, and his commander was captured, and about 3,000 men surrendered on one day. So he was then captured, sent to England briefly, and then to the United States, to Reading. Otto Wilke. He was almost a year older than my father, and he was also conscripted in 1940. He had a thriving practice as a painter. He was also a painter, and he had a master's certificate. And getting a master's certificate for any vocational profession in Germany is a very difficult process. You have to go through apprenticeship, journeyman, and then master. So He was trained as a rifleman. He was also in a unit that was in Operation Barbarossa going into Russia. But he was assigned to an ordnance unit where he basically was involved in repairing vehicles. And so he was not a frontline soldier. At 44 years old, he was probably a bit too old to be frontline. At the end of the war, they didn't care. But at that time, they did. He was injured, not in combat, but he injured his foot very badly and was actually sent back to Germany to recover. And then he was assigned to a home guard unit. Eventually in 44, his home guard unit was sent down to the south of France in the area of Nice. And then he was captured when the Americans invaded the southern France in Operation Anvil. He was originally sent to Virginia and then transferred up to Reading. So in late 1944, these three men came together at the Reading Army Airfield. Both Walter and Otto and several others were assigned to my father in the paint shop. Okay, there we go. So just a little bit about the Reading Army Airfield. And there's a thing here for somebody trying to be admitted. Do I click that? I think I did. I think somebody is trying to get on, and I guess I had control. And okay, there we go. I want to just throw a thank you out to Terry Soroka. Terry is the general manager of the airport. He has an incredible collection of photos from through the history of the airport, and he was kind enough to share all those with me. So a lot of the pictures in my book are ones that he donated. So the Reading Airport was opened in 1938. It was dedicated in 1939. The Army saw that this would be a good potential airfield to use for training. And so they leased the airfield from the city of Reading, and it became operational on June 1st, 1943, with the mission to do training of reconnaissance units and communication units and so forth. It was under the 3rd Air Force at that time. On January 1st, 1944, it was reassigned to the Air Technical Service Command and became a sub-base of the Middletown Air Depot up near Harrisburg. And their mission then was not only to train, but also to repair and overhaul aircraft, either to return them to active duty or to storage. They did a lot on B-24 bombers. At one point, there were about 325 bombers on the field out there, which I would have loved to see. That must have been quite a sight. I have been unable to find any pictures of that, regrettably. So a lot of people are not aware that we did have a tremendous number of POWs in the United States. You know, why were they here? Well, the bulk of them were starting to be captured after D-Day. We then started capturing thousands of prisoners. We had acquired there were a lot of prisoners taken in North Africa, both German and Italian. But in terms of holding the prisoners, clearly there was no room in France to do it. I mean, that was a combat zone. England was stressed as it was, barely having enough food and resources for their own population. So England and the United States made a deal that the bulk of the German prisoners would be sent to the United States. So they were sent over. Liberty ships would deliver supplies to Europe, and then the prisoners were put on the Liberty ships to bring them back to the United States because they were empty at that point. By the end of the war, there were over almost 426,000 POWs in the United States. The bulk of them German, over almost 372,000 Germans in the United States. And they were spread out over about 666 POW camps and facilities throughout the country. Virtually every state had camps, 155 base camps, and when those were filled, they had branch camps. Indiantown Gap was the main base camp for Pennsylvania. It opened September 8th, 1944. And then Reading was, Indiantown Gap opened before that, but Reading opened September 8th, 1944 with 30 prisoners. By October 1st, there were 243 prisoners in camp, and the census averaged about 258 prisoners throughout until through the end, actually through February of 1946. When the war was over, we did not send them back right away. The prisoners were a valuable source of labor, especially since so many of the American laborers were in the military, and so we needed them. The camp closed in February 15th, 1946. The prisoners were repatriated, some directly home and some to England. So just, I know Bonnie knows this very well because she lived in the POW camp after the war, were transformed into housing for returning veterans. And Bonnie lived in those. So here's Burn Road. And then the Schuylkill River. This is a current Google, well, not current anymore, but a Google map. And the camp was right over in this area along the river. It's now been turned into going to be turned into an industrial park. It has been totally bulldozed. You see no remnants of the camp at all. This was taken shortly after the war. You can see the barracks. Originally, the barracks were built to house American soldiers. But then when it was converted into a POW camp, the prisoners were then, it was refurbished with a stockade and so forth, so the prisoners could be housed there. This is Center City, Reading would be over here. This is looking south, aerial view. This is an actual blueprint of and now you're not going to be able to read this, actual blueprint of the camp. There were two stockades. The initial one was here. And then as they in 45, they needed to expand and they added another stockade here. The the guards were housed in between. And this is the only picture that I've ever been able to find. It was in the Reading Eagle. I cannot find what the date of the Eagle was that was published. But this is the camp shortly after the war with the guard towers, stockade in place, and the barracks. This is one of the barracks in 1952, to give you an idea. I mean, I remember driving by some of the workshops and so forth. My father very proudly saying, "I painted those," and he was responsible for all paint work on the base. This was the stockade office. This was the last remaining building. I came up here, I was up here in February. I went out and took a picture of it. In April, it was destroyed to make way for the industrial park. There was attempts to try and get it to be preserved, but it failed. So it gives you an idea of what it looked like. So the POWs, we treated the POWs well. America adhered to the Geneva Convention 1929, which said that POWs must at all times be humanely treated and protected. And part of the motive for that was, if we treat the prisoners well here, the hope was that the information would filter back to Germany and that the Germans might treat our prisoners equally as well. That wasn't actually the case. Certainly in Japan, there was that was not even an issue. The prisoners were lodged in the buildings. They all had about 40 square feet. Each prisoner had about 40 square feet of private space. They were given the same food rations as the American soldiers. That created some issues with the populace because they were on rations. The people felt that they were actually getting better food than they were. In some cases, that probably was true. But the prisoners were provided with laundry, recreational medical facilities. They did their own cooking, and they were under guard, but they weren't given any liberties. They had visits from priests and ministers, so they were able to practice their religion. Walter was a very strong Catholic, and he became very close to one of the priests. I think it was from St. John's. But one of the conditions allowed with the Geneva Conventions is that the captors were allowed to use the prisoners for labor. And ideally, according to what, the officers were not required to work as hard or if at all, but the enlisted men, they tried to assign them to areas where they had some expertise. Walter was a lithographer. He had some artistic background. Otto was a painter. Another person, Daniel Falconer, was also a painter. So that would have been assigned to my father. The way it worked, contractors, whether farmers or factory workers or foremen, would request the POWs for work. The contractors are charged the going rate for an American, $3.58 a day if it's for a farm worker, $8 a day for a factory labor. The POWs were only paid 80 cents a day in canteen coupons. They could go to the canteen, buy coffee, cigarettes, beer, toiletries, whatever. And so the government actually made a profit from the whole thing. A lot of that money was funneled back in up the maintenance of the facilities and so forth. But the government did pretty well. And we needed the workers because most of our workers were fighting. So it served a major purpose to keep up the war effort. They were not allowed to work in specific armament industries or anything that was specifically related to war. So farming was one of the major things. A special projects program was established to basically educate, quote unquote, the prisoners to democracy and so forth, and to try and teach them that that the fascists were not good and so forth. And a lot of them already knew that. And the idea was the Americans were looking ahead. They knew that these men would go back to Germany. Some would be involved in politics. They would be in positions of authority. And if they had a good opinion of the United States, that would benefit us. 75% of the German prisoners left the United States with an appreciation of the value of democracy and a friendly attitude. Hundreds filed for immigration upon arriving home, and many settled in the same area as their camp. They knew the people, and they had developed relationships. Walter wanted to come back to the United States and work with my father, but as you'll find out, there were some reasons that kept him there. It was quoted in one book, the prisoners' opinions of the United States were more significantly impacted by the kindness of local residents than by re-education and propaganda efforts. So it was really that personal interaction that Americans were able, not all, but many Americans were able to look past the fact that we were fighting the Germans and treated them as human beings. And you see this in the letters. Otto wrote to my father in 1946, "I often think of you, my dear Roy. You were a man who had a heart for us." He wrote later, "When I was receiving a picture from the stockade of the airfield," he tried to write in English. His English is, most of the letters were in German. "When I was receiving a picture from the stockade of the airfield is my joy, and I remember it has been a good time in the USA. When I get to think of the good times in the States, I'd like to go back there. How could I ever forget what you did for me in Reading? I often tell my loved ones about it. How many times have you made me happy with ice cream when it was so hot? I have not forgotten anything." And you can just picture my father taking to work on a hot day, a gallon of ice cream, and they all start diving in and having a good time eating the ice cream and just talking like as buddies. I think one of the most meaningful to me, Walter wrote to my father in 1957, long after the war, "And you were always a good friend to me, and one never felt in your presence that one was a POW. It was just an understanding. human to human. If you know German, es war eben ein Verstehen von Mensch zu Mensch. The word Mensch has a stronger connotation than human. It's more like all what is good about humanity. And this was, I mean, he really, it's clear that this was a very close relationship and that they really had a tremendous affection for each other. And then Carl Ritzenbaum, I only have one letter from him, and he's where I got the title for the book. He said, "Never I shall forget these human people." And he was writing in English. I think he would have mentioned, if he was writing in German, he probably would have used the word Mensch also. My father wrote back to Manfred Gemp. He said, "I will say that you and all your comrades that worked in my shop were honest, faithful to me, and never once betrayed any trust I placed in you. May God bless you and your parents, hoping that if and when we meet again, we can shake hands as two free people." Regrettably, that never happened. With Manfred ended up, his home was in East Germany, and with the Cold War, something like that could not have happened. So, little timeline: 1940, May 7th, the war ended, and then they were just repatriated. I'm gonna go through. Otto was lucky. He went pretty much almost directly back to Germany. He said after a stormy crossing, we landed in France after 14 days, stayed there for a month, and then came to Germany. There also a short time in a camp and was released. I have found all my family, and you can probably imagine how happy my wife and my boy were when I came. My business is still in order. We're doing quite well with the Russians who are here with us, and they are not such bad people. That sentiment will change. Walter pretty much spelled out his return very carefully in one long letter, which he smuggled out of a prison camp. He wasn't supposed to write long letters. He left Reading in January of 46, was taken to Indiantown Gap, and then transported to Fort Shanks. Fort Shanks was a major staging area for a large number of our troops going to Europe, but also then was a staging area to return the prisoners to Germany. It was easy access to the harbor in New York City, where they were sent on in Liberty ships and sent back to Germany. He said, "Probably this will be the last letter I'm able to write to you from the United States or from USA. This week, many of my comrades and myself expect to depart. Mr. Rank, I received mail from my parents last week." This is the first letter he got from them, dated January 28th, 1946. "They are well so far, and our house is still standing. You might imagine how glad I am. I regret that it was not possible for me to come along and see you once more. Farewell, Mr. Rank. Thanks again for all the good you have done to me." He was taken, and I'm just kind of watching my time. I'm going to skip over this part, but he was taken to Antwerp. I read this. 2 days before we docked in Antwerp, we passed through the Channel. We passed near the English coast and stayed a day before Dover. It was a beautiful sight to see the white cliffs. The tugboats swirled around us, and you could see many other ocean ships riding at anchor. Small boats hummed busily back and forth. This spectacle was beautiful to look at. Had it not been for the terrible uncertainty that was read on every single face of ours, what do they plan for us? Are we to be sold to England? Will we really go home? And then they were taken down to Brussels. Oh, they said then we arrived in Antwerp and still believed the promise which American officers and religious officials gave us on the way, promising us the journey home. The mood among most of the comrades is this: the Nazis have betrayed us. The democracies treat us like white slaves. We who were in America have certainly worked peacefully and want to carry the restored peace back to Germany. They were frustrated. They realized that they might not actually be going home. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. They were sent to Brussels, where they were put in camps with miserable conditions. A lot of groups in England actually helped intervene to help to get the conditions better. I'm just going to skip past that. He was taken to POW Camp in England for a few months. This is his artwork. He stayed at this area where this white limestone white horse carved. It dates back into the Vikings, carved in the side of the hill. And he made this drawing in the one letter to my father of the camp, and then the white horse there. They were given more freedom there. He was allowed to walk around. They could actually hike out, but they still had to work. But they were treated well at the camp there. And his attitude improved. And what I love about these letters, he was very open with my father. They clearly had a very close relationship. Walter's son, Wolfram, told me that Walter looked to my father as a father figure. My father was considerably older than Walter. Mr. Rank, I am further a PW, but it is easier feeling when boys like we can go out without guarded. During the war and also my PW life, I saw many countries and people, what I did never seen in peacetime. These experiences which I earned shall lead me through my entire life. Nowadays, I have a better sight in world affairs. That is my profit, but I miss the same time was and is the freedom. I'm knowing the day is not so far away when I get it back, and then I will start a new life. And from there, he was taken up to Hull. They were taken over to Cuxhaven, and he came back to Wuppertal, Barmen, October 6, 1946, after being imprisoned for about a year and a half. And this is what he came back to. I'm sure he got off the train and saw almost 40% of Wuppertal was totally destroyed. 42,000 residential houses were gone. And I'm going to just do a tangent for a second because, after this, sorry. And he wrote immediately, 3 days after he got home, he wrote to my father, "Now I am at home, and I'm happy to be a free man again. How long have I wished this day where I may enter my parents' house? It was last Sunday afternoon when I entered the house. I cannot tell you my feelings and those of my parents. My mother wept. He said, here in Wuppertal it is very hard to live, harder than I thought. My loved ones look older than before. I left them 2.5 years ago. The weight of my mother is only 97 pounds. The last days of the war, I lost my uncle with aunt and cousin during a bombardment. Their house is here at the same street. With my cousin, I grew up together and she was a nice girl." So he returned home, but it was happy to see the family, but there were a lot of issues. I'm putting this up there real quickly because the Why Missing Library is sponsoring this. So I thought I need to say something about Ferdinand Thun and Heinrich Janssen because there's a connection. They were both born in Wuppertal, Barmen, just a couple streets apart. They didn't meet until they came to the United States, but they were well known over there. And my father had apparently written, when Henry Janssen died in 1948, written to Walter, and Walter wrote back, "Mr. Janssen's death was known here in Wuppertal, Barmen. He has many relations here, and a street has his name. He and Mr. Thun did many good things for the population of Wuppertal." The article about Mr. Janssen you sent me is very interesting for me. A year later, Walter sent my father the German obituary for Ferdinand Thun, which was written by a cousin, Hermann Thun, talking about all the things that they did for Wuppertal after the war. They did not forget their homeland. So war ended in 1997. July, August was Potsdam, where the fate of Germany was to be decided by Stalin, Churchill, and Truman. And as you all know, Germany was divided into 4 parts. Wuppertal was in the British sector where Walter was. Otto was near Leipzig in the Soviet sector. The Hague Convention said that the victor in the war, basically the occupying power, was to do everything possible to restore order and safety and to help the people. That was not the case. Various agencies established, and this is still true, 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day is a reasonable amount of calories to survive very well. The Allied governments took a very vindictive approach. Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary Treasurer for Roosevelt, and was very bitter toward the Germans and advised basically taking away all industry and knocking them back to the Stone Age. Roosevelt was in sympathy to that, although all the things that Morgenthau wanted to do, fortunately, were not implemented. They came up with a formula to prevent disease and prevent revolution if they could give the people anywhere from about 1,500 calories per day. Now that is starvation. In a moment of vanity, about 2 years ago, I decided I was going to go on a massive diet, and I restricted myself to 1,500 or less calories a day. I lost 40 pounds in a month. And they were on this at this level for a year or so. So it was basically starvation. And what complicated things, Germany had, before the war, Germany had parts of what is now Poland. As soon as that was given to the Soviet bloc, all the Germans were expelled and had to return to Germany. So you had over 10 million people coming into particularly the Western zones. And so you're adding more mouths to an area which wasn't able to support the population it already had. The planting season had been disrupted because of the war. The Russians were supposed to provide food from the Eastern Germany, which was the major agricultural area, but they didn't. And then priority was given to housing and feeding of non-German displaced persons and liberated allies. Otto said, of course, in May of 1946, of course, the food situation is not good. And I often think of our good food on the airfield. If you were here in Germany, you could put panes in windows indefinitely. Probably the bombs knocked all the glass out of all the windows. There's almost no tobacco. Otto was a heavy smoker. And I like to think of the great time with you because I always had some. When the whole situation in Germany gets better, send me some cigarettes, but not now. If the packet comes from America now, it will be stolen right away. Walter wrote, he went to visit Daniel, who was also one of the prisoners who worked with my father. He said, there in the American zone, it is possible to live much better. We also talked a lot about you and our work together on the airfield. I got some groceries there so we could eat something at home. Daniel lived in the American sector near Marburg. The American citizens wanted to help, but they were not allowed to send private help. There was even no mail service until September of 45. Finally, the Allies, the British and Americans started to think we need to, that they started realizing, and General Lucius Clay, who was the military governor for the American sector, he said, there is no choice between becoming a communist on 1,500 calories and a believer in democracy on 1,000 calories. It is my sincere belief that our proposed ration allowance in Germany will not only defeat our objectives in Middle Europe, but will pave the road to a communist Germany. We started to realize if we don't help the Germans, they might move toward the Soviets. So you're seeing the beginnings of the Cold War here. By summer of 46, Truman then allowed relief organizations to send humanitarian aid. And then September 6th, James Burns, who was the Secretary of State, gave a speech in Stuttgart. In my opinion, this is the beginning of the Cold War. He said, we favor the economic unification of Germany. If complete unification cannot be secured, we shall do everything in our power to secure the maximum possible unification. The Potsdam Treaty said that Germany was supposed to be unified and that the Allies were to work together. The Soviets were not playing ball, and England and Britain decided we need to move ahead. And so they said this, and it followed it, which is basically throwing down the gauntlet. It is our view that the German people should now be permitted and help to make the necessary preparations for setting up a democratic German government. The Soviet Union was all for a united Germany, but they wanted communist. And so the Americans and British were moving ahead without the Russians. But then complicated things, 1946 to 1947, was the worst winter in the 20th century. Cold, the people had no coal, they had no food, it was basically starvation. Walter said we had severe cold for a while. We had no coal for heating, and so I had to go find wood in the forest. But one is not allowed to cut down the trees. Yes, Mr. Rank, the days were bitterly cold in the rooms. Thus, in addition to the food deprivation, there is still the possibility of freezing. The Christmas holidays are on our doorstep, he said in December of 46. Only here in Germany will not be so happily celebrated. It has become so bitterly cold that in addition to the food depletion, that of freezing is added. Although we live in the Ruhr area, we do not receive domestic coal. He said, Christmas Day, he said, early this morning I attended Christmas Mass. The way to the church was very nice. Some of the bells even sounded from burned out churches. Our church was so full that not all the faithful could enter it. It is true, humanity longs for peace. May the leaders soon take pity on us Germans. The misery is too horrible. I'm just going to skip on over that. I'm watching my time here. I'm running long. And he has said winter is exceptionally hard and cold this year. Despite everything, I could not avoid losing my physical strength. Now, like so many other people, I am undernourished. I have been ill for over 3 weeks. Tens of thousands of people starved to death. And then he finally got the first package from my father. Today, I now give you the good news that I received your package from January 15th, 1947. It took 2 months to get there. The need in our Germany is great, and your helping hand does so much good to us. A friend in need is a friend indeed. Mr. Rank, I'll never forget you. Some days will be better for me, then I will repay you for everything. It would be really nice if I could work with you. It was really a nice time to be with you. I am many times in America with my thoughts. I will come as soon as I get a chance. I believe that we will see each other again. Let's see. I'm just going to skip over that. This is just one package. It was no food items, but a package that was sent. My father and then my mother, when they got married, were sending packages almost once a month to both him and Otto. Shoes, pants, basic things. Walter was not a smoker, but my father was, and he always felt that he needed to send that. The cigarettes actually were very useful in the black market. Now, whether Walter ever used that or not, I don't know. And another package, he sent tobacco, meat, flour, vegetable fat. They had trouble getting fat, and you need fat to subsist. You need to have those calories. Candy, noodle soup, cocoa, chewing gum. And Otto wrote too, that was a real pleasure, dear Roy. I knew you would not forget me. As I saw the old gold cigarettes, Otto was a smoker. I had to think about our farewell hour when you gave me one more pack. Thank you very much for everything. You cannot imagine how indescribable our joy is over these good things. The cocoa is great. We each had a few spoonfuls of it, like the purest milk chocolate. How long we have been without all these goodies. And you can just imagine them, they all gathering a spoon and digging into the cocoa. And I can say that when need is greatest, God's help is closest. This is written from Otto's wife to Roy. If you could see my Otto now, he has become very thin and no longer looks like his old self. That's why he likes to think about the time in America. And again, I'm just going to skip over that. He got another package in July of 47. It was a great joy for us all to receive your dear package. Let me say a heartfelt thank you from me and my family. You cannot imagine how much we can use all these things, and at all times when the need is greatest. God's help is always there. Of course, the coffee tastes great, and we have fat smeared bread. Oh, my dear Roy, thank heaven I have you, and you have helped me so much. So by the end of 1946, the American public came through for Germany. And by in the 46, 17 million pounds of parcels were sent to Germans. And in 3 years, today's dollars, $2.3 billion worth of things were sent by private American citizens, which for me is just remarkable. We had just finished fighting a war. Many people had lost loved ones. It was a horrible time, but they still wanted to help. My mother lost her first husband in France. And when her and my father got married, she joined in to help him send the packages. I'm going to skip through the politics here a bit. Um, Essentially, the British and Americans were going to go alone. They started the process of organizing the German government and getting them in a position so they could eventually be take care of themselves. Things started going better for Walter, and I love this one. He said, "Last week I saw an American movie in the theater, Going My Way with Bing Crosby. In German, the movie was called The Road to Happiness. It was in English, and I really liked it. By the way, this is the first American movie that we have seen since being released." And then the reason he decided not to come to the United States. Mr. Rank, as you can see, I have found my fortune. For the most holy Christmas, I will be engaged to a good and beautiful girl. And this is, but things were not to be perfect. Mr. Rank, he wrote in February 1st, Mr. Rank, now I have found a nice girl. Her name is Ilza, and we both love each other. As soon as possible, I will lead her to the altar. At the moment, I am very sad. Ilza has been attacked by a bad illness, is now in the hospital. Diphtheria is the name of the disease, and it is contagious. I cannot go to her and cannot comfort her. I hope and pray to God that she will be well soon. Because of the nutrition and the lack of nutrition, the lack of good infrastructure, lack of medicine, diphtheria, typhus, tuberculosis ran wild in all of Europe and in Germany also. And so Ilza came down with diphtheria. That's February 1st. He wrote again a month later. I cannot tell you how surprised I was when I received your wonderful package last week. I will give the dress to Ilza as soon as she is released from the hospital. Yes, my dear bride, Ilza is still ill. The danger of diphtheria is over, but she has now gotten heart muscle inflammation from the strong injections. Only with quiet can she convalesce, and therefore she still has to stay in bed. With God's help, she will soon recuperate. Fortunately, she recuperated, and in October, they got married on the day of the 50th anniversary of Ilza's parents. However, in the Soviet zone, things were not looking up. Otto wrote in July of 1947, in the shop, I still have a lot to do. I get material from the factory, otherwise I could not work. My previous suppliers have nothing left. The money is more and more, my dear Roy, but for us it is worthless because you cannot buy anything. Inflation was runaway. We still do not feel better in Germany, and at the conference in London, they sit and talk and cannot help the world because they do not want to. I often think of you, my dear Roy, and the time in Reading with you will always be unforgettable. I never felt as a PW. Today I am free again, yet not free. And now they speak of a new war. I think I am free again, but not yet not free. And so this is the beginnings of, this was the Soviet zone. And this is very sad. The Christmas celebration passed us by in silence. In former times, it was a great joy, but today one wishes that there were no more holidays. To imagine how bad things were, to wish that you had no more holidays. It was obviously bad. The London conference was the last opportunity. The British and Americans tried to reason with the Soviets, but they walked out of the meeting, and it was inevitable that Germany was going to remain divided. The Marshall Plan was instituted April 3rd, which was a plan that helped bail out Europe. It was totally responsible for restoring order in Europe. The Soviet bloc was invited, but they declined. And then you can see from Walter, things are starting to get bad. The Cold War is cranking up. We all living in a bad time. You can read it in the papers and hear it by radio. The Russians are working badly. I don't like a war. The German people are for a free democratic state. Only a little group is pro-Russian. Then the Allies instituted a currency reform, got rid of the old reform of old money, set it up so the black market would not operate. And I'm just going to skip past this. Basically, Western Germany was given a whole new currency. All of a sudden, almost overnight, the store shelves had food in them, had clothing. They had been saving up, and now people could actually buy things. The Russians viewed this as, did not like this because they saw it as a potential that the Western allies were trying to devalue the Soviet side's currency, and that would eventually try and get that side to lean more toward the West. So in retribution, on June 24th, they instituted the Berlin blockade in an attempt to try and take over all of Berlin. And as I'm sure you're all aware, for almost the next year, Truman authorized, and the British and the Americans authorized airlift to keep food and fuel and supplies coming into Berlin to keep West Berlin afloat. Again, I'm sorry, I really underestimated my time here. West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, was born May 24th, 1949. October 7th, what the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, became official. Things were really looking good in the West. For Otto, it was still bad. For a long time, the potatoes have been finished, but then your dehydrated potatoes came to us as if called. Now we had hoped for the new harvest, but they have confiscated them again. And we must submit to the orders of the occupying power. You cannot believe how many times I think about my imprisonment right now. It was a wonderful time. The treasures that were sent before us. It's really sad. He was a prisoner of war, but he looks upon this as one of the best time of his life. And he said, we all have no more hope that better times will come again.
Wow.
And he said, how is our situation actually judged by you in America? Is there talk of war? I do not want to go back. Have had enough of it. The captivity of America was still the best of it, thinking happily back upon it. Let's skip over this. Apparently my father and mother sent a purse over for Margarita. And I thought, this is cute. You are, for me and my family, a faithful friend. The handbox or purse that has my wife every day. If she goes into town and the acquainted to say, oh, how beautiful. My wife said, full of happiness, and I'm sure proudly, from the friend from my husband from the USA. And yeah, I'm just going to skip these. You can get the book. And then a letter came. It was horrible English. I struggled with it for a while. And based on the following letter, what he all of a sudden in January of 1950, and I'm getting close to the end, he says, thinks please not that I openly write if you send a packet. It comes me only at your friendship on. You have me helped, dear Roy, in bad time. Thank you forever. What he's saying is that don't send me any more packages. And that's interesting. Then he wrote, my father apparently didn't understand or went ahead, had already a package on their way. And November, Otto wrote back, why have you sent a present? In my last letter, I have written the time is here, not more bad before 2 years. It's worse than 2 years ago. But my joy is great and many thanks to you, Roy. In the future, no more send packet. And I kind of struggled with what was going on here. And then my wife and I were talking and we realized February of 1950, East Germany instituted the Stasi, which is the East German security police. This is one of the most oppressive police forces in all of history. They read everything. They had informants. 1 in 36 citizens were informants for the Stasi. You had family members reporting on other family members. It was brutal. And clearly Otto would have been aware of this, and he was probably afraid that if a package came from America, the Stasi would target him. They could take somebody out of their job. They could be sent to prison or worse. And so I'm sure that was what he was worried about. We'll never know, because this was the last letter that my father received from his friend. So just kind of wrap things up. My father, after the war, went into, was self-employed as a painter and paper hanger. Did a lot of work here in Wyomissing. He continued to write to Walter to the end of his life. They maintained a friendship. In 1967, my father did his one and only trip to Germany to visit Walter. And after 20 years, they were reunited. He died in 1974. Walter lived to a ripe old age of 87. He became very active. He was in a printing shop. He became very active in the union. Actually, at one point, consulted with Willy Brandt, who was the Chancellor of Germany. He had a son and 3 grandchildren. And and Ilse preceded him about 5 years in passing. Otto died only about a year and a half later after the last letter he sent to my father. We don't know, have not been able to find out why or from what he died, but he had a rough life, and it was really a shame. He had a great sense of humor. I skipped over some of the things he wrote. I would love to have met him. Anyway, that's it. Sorry, I went a little bit long, but if anybody has any questions, I'd be delighted to answer. And I guess I can unshare here. Hopefully.
Yes. So does anybody have any questions? I do.
Sure.
Actually, I have 2 questions. Were only men prisoners of war? Were there any women, German?
I have not seen any evidence of German women prisoners of war.
Okay.
I've read a lot of articles about various prison camps and so forth. I've never seen any evidence for that.
Okay. And my other question is, if a prisoner of war, could they be released here, say here in Reading? Could their term be up?
No, they were all repatriated back.
They had to go back to Germany,
and then they
if
could
wanted
apply
to
to come back.
Okay. Okay.
And a lot of them did.
Yeah.
And Walter really wanted to, because he felt he could help his parents better by getting a job here.
Mm-hmm.
And he would have had a job. I'm sure my father would have taken him on right away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Okay. And there's a comment here in the chat from Barbara. Great presentation.
Oh.
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was a great presentation.
Very fine.
I'll say something real quick.
Go ahead.
It was, Roger, thank you. I'm so glad that I got to meet you, and you told us things about the Reading Airport down the old Army barracks that us kids never knew. And it was such a pleasure. And I love the book. Thank you for the book. And yeah, the story's amazing. Yeah.
Thank you.
The story is just amazing. It really is. And a shame there weren't more people, or, more that people could know about this ahead of time. I only found out about this morning, and I knew your story. We've sat and talked, and and Sandy and Mike just loved you. They thought it was amazing from Saturday night.
Good.
So thank you again. Yeah,
my pleasure.
Thank you again. Yeah.
Well, I apologize for the short notice, but we only found out about this a week ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's my fault, really.
This hasn't
Ron
been
Devlin suggested I contact Ann, and I emailed her last Wednesday, and so it was really short notice.
Okay, it was short.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Very
But,
interesting.
it is a fascinating story when you read the letters.
Yeah,
They're very emotional, and I was talking of Gary before everybody else came on, that soldiers from the war, and any war, don't want to talk about things, and there's so much. Walter's son Wolfram, he didn't know any of this, and I shared all the letters and the book and everything with him, and so what he knows about his father at least during the wartime period, it comes from the letters that he wrote to my father. And
Wow.
then the research I was able to do to track down his military history.
Mm.
And I mean, I have a good friend who was a medic in Vietnam. The only time I was able to get him open up is after we had a lot of beer.
Yeah.
And but it's and yeah, it's something that is they have, and that's what I think is so neat about the letters, is that you have
Mhm.
close friends here opening up with each other,
Mhm.
but they would not do it with their own families.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway,
Mhm. Well, I want to say one more thing. If you guys do get the book and look at the pictures when I'm in the book,
Oh, yeah.
my mother, my father, Sandy, we grew up there. You can see our house, and you can see us waiting for the school bus. And yeah, it just breaks my heart that they destroyed everything that's there. It's tragic. There's the kids today and the people from future generations are going to never know that even existed unless it gets carried on through somebody talking about it. And it's funny because Sandy and I would always go up to the old control tower. We'd walk up and take 2 chairs, and we'd have a glass of wine, and we'd just sit there and reminisce, and it's gone now. It's gone.
Yeah.
They did destroy that. So
Now, when I gave this talk at the Berks History Center, Bonnie came up to me and told me that she had lived in those houses, and she was kind enough to give me a lot of pictures from that time, and really adds that's part of the epilogue in the book, and it really is fascinating. But yep, it's all gone, but it's there in memories and pictures.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was a great place to live. And at that time, us kids, we didn't know they were Army barracks. We had no idea, until we became actually a little bit older. But, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade, they were just our house. And they were cute little homes, and it all worked out. So a lot of memories there, a lot of memories. That's for sure. Yeah. Well, thank you, Roger, so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments?
I don't have any questions, but I thought it was very good, a lot more than I wanted to know about how bad it was.
Yeah.
I'm 69, so my father was in that war. I'm the Vietnam era. That's my husband's that. And that was a different type of thing too, because you went to Vietnam and everybody back here didn't like you no matter what you did. But this, you just starved to death and things. It just seems like things that were so unnecessary.
Yeah, we think of the war is over, and we think from our own standpoint, things got better in the United States.
Yeah.
It wasn't really publicized, or there's not that much known about how much all the Europeans and the Germans also, all suffered because the infrastructure was gone.
It's just sad. And then you never got another letter, so you knew what was going to happen.
Yeah.
That's just sad. I didn't cry, but I wasn't expecting to be so down when this was over. But thank you very much. It was worth sitting and listening to it. I enjoyed it.
Good.
Yes, thank you. I kind of remember learning about the Berlin airlift, and how bad things were in Europe.
Yeah.
And I also remember when we first came to Reading in the mid-70s, the barracks was still there.
Yeah,
they were.
And somebody told us that they had been POW camps.
Right. The airlift is really, the Germans have such an appreciation of that. And there's a famous story about the candy bomber. I don't know if you ever heard about this. One of the pilots flying one of the C-47s routinely into Berlin, as he was making the approach, he had tied little parachutes on candy bars, and he dropped them out of the plane for all the kids.
Neat.
And he became known as the candy bomber, and all the kids would line up getting ready, waiting for him to come in. And it it's a really fascinating story. And the German, I've been to Berlin a couple times, and I visited the spot where Kennedy gave his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech. And there's still tremendous affection. I think the Americans are still held in high esteem in Germany.
Well, I think they're coming
My
back.
father-in-law and mother-in-law were 10 years old at the end of the war, and I've gotten my father-in-law to talk about his situation. They were sent out when the bombing got heavy in Frankfurt. He and his mother and sister were sent out to the rural areas. They ended up in a town. The Americans are coming through. The Germans were there resisting. He and his mother and sister were in a basement, and an SS soldier came down into the basement, going just kind of crazy, and said, I'm going to die. Why should you live?
Ooh.
And something happened that he left. And then when things died down, my father-in-law, they came up, saw dead bodies all over the place, and were escorted back to safety by the Americans. He has fond memories of the one soldier giving him a Hershey bar. And it was a tough time. And my wife's grandfather was captured in Russia. And he actually came back about 3 years later. He was actually released, and very few German prisoners came back to Russia.
Yeah.
But she said he never talked
About it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting when having strong connections with Germany and seeing it from that side. And I was very happy when my wife and I were married. We were married in Germany. My mother came over, and her first husband was killed by the Germans, but she had no problems with it. She related to everybody, and I think so many Americans were willing to forgive and forget. Never forget.
Never forget. Never forget.
Yeah.
Forgive, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting times.
Okay, any other questions?
I have a comment, if that's okay. Roger, you know that Sandy and I did a bus tour of the airport.
Yes,
through the
you sent me a
lock
flyer
house.
from that.
Yes, from the lock house. And
Mhm.
there was an elderly gentleman on the bus. And remember, I told you that he said over in Riverview Park, that's right there, they could hear the German prisoners singing at night. I just thought that was so interesting that they were happy, obviously. They sure wouldn't be singing, I don't think.
They were
But they could hear them echo. It would echo right across, to Riverview Park, because it was right directly across where the barracks were. Then there's which was Mitchell Road. Then it was the Schuylkill River. Then it was Riverview Park. And
they were treated well, and and again, you can tell from the letters they had good memories. And in the book, I have a sample menu that they had. They ate well. Yeah.
Maybe we were a kinder nation then.
Maybe.
I think it helped, especially here. But they were all over the United States, but the Germans were closer in heritage to Americans in general than, say, the Japanese.
So I was just going to say what we did to the Japanese was horrible. Yeah.
Pardon?
What we did to the Japanese was terrible.
Oh yeah, but what they did to our prisoners was also,
Right.
Yep.
And of course, very few of them surrendered. That's why there were so few Japanese prisoners here. Now there were recalcitrant Germans. There were a lot of SS that were captured, and the military put the SS POWs in separate camps. They tried to keep them isolated from the other Wehrmacht, because a lot of the SS were still very fanatical and tried to stage revolts and so forth. But the bulk of the German prisoners were not Nazis. They were just normal men who were drafted and served their country.
Yeah. They had no choice, I guess.
Yeah, they had no choice. There, I think the alternative would have been not very good.
Yeah,
You didn't do you weren't a pacifist there.
right, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no more questions, I want to say thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you so
fun.
much.
I love talking about it, obviously.
So keep in touch. Have a safe trip back to Arkansas.
Okay,
Keep
I
in
will.
touch.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you
Yeah,
all for
Roger.
tuning in.
Keep
Notice
in
my
touch,
good Southern
Roger.
accent, you all.
Yeah, okay, there you go.
Yeah, keep in touch, Roger. Safe travels.
I will. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, keep in
Good
touch.
Thank you.
Have a good
Right.
one.
Good night,
Good night,
everyone.
Night.
Night.
Bye.